Leigh Bowery is a name synonymous with creativity, with club life, with alternative fashion. He had an impact on the industry that is still felt and celebrated today in both club life and in high art spaces like the Tate Gallery. An impact like his is unsurmountable. But what of the person behind the magic? This is the biography of Leigh Bowery. This video is sponsored by Incogni, a frankly brilliant tool that saves your personal data from being breached through the wrong hands. For me personally, this meant that my business email had breached my personal data to 48 different data brokers who I had never heard of, but had collected my name, email, phone number, and my home address, passing them around to whoever without my consent. Which, for context, I'm faceless online. I don't use my business email for anything personal. I don't attach it to my name, my phone number, or address, or any of the other things unless absolutely necessary. So for Incogni to have found 48 different data brokers, I was shocked. My experience with Incogni was fast, easy, and honestly shocking how much data breaching they saved me from. So if you also care about your privacy as I do, Incogni is one of the easiest ways to protect it. Here is my code UNDERSTITCHYT for 60% off an annual plan, and don't forget there's a 30-day money-back guarantee, so there's no risk to trying it out at all. Thank you again to Incogni for sponsoring this video. Leigh Bowery was born on the 26th of March 1961 in Sunshine, Australia, to parents Tom and Evelyn Bowery, who, like their neighbours, were the average working-class Australian young family typical of the area. As such, Bowery's early years were, by and large, uneventful. He attended church with his parents, went to their Salvation Army meetings, and on special occasions would even go to the local cinema, which seemingly was the only form of entertainment in the area. As a baby, he was famously large. He got the name Big Leigh as soon as he started attending school, and had long, blonde, curly hair, which meant that strangers often thought that he was female, which was rather funny to his parents because when Leigh's sister Bronwyn was born in 1962, 20 months later, she was for a long time bald, and strangers conversely thought she was a boy. By the time the pair of siblings had made the good judgment to grow out of being toddlers, they became good friends, finding kinship in their notably strict household. Together, they were raised very conservatively in a uniquely Christian way, which forbade things like swearing, the lottery, and even local raffles. Quote, their parents put great emphasis on manners and how to behave in public. They were taught to respect their elders and other people's property. Their father wouldn't let them watch soap operas on the television and only allowed them to see the news, current affairs, documentaries, and films that weren't smutty. As it was a traditional home, that also meant that it was patriarchal, which for Leigh meant that more conformity was expected of him than it was of Bronwyn. And because he was particularly large as a boy, he was also expected to be further mature, which his mother didn't overly like because he was just a boy, which is what she said to defend him from his father. Not that that mattered, because Leigh was already so strong-willed anyway that he just wouldn't listen lest he was given a decent explanation of why he should abide with whatever his father was telling him to do. In this sense, Leigh was quickly very intelligent, a trait which certainly becomes clear upon attendance to the local primary school where he excelled at most subjects. Though Sue Tilley does point out in her book that this was probably helped by the fact that most of his neighbours were not born of natively English-speaking parents, as the area was somewhat full of Greek and Italian immigrants, so they just couldn't help the children with their homework, and Tom and Evelyn could, which may be why Leigh and Bronwyn excelled. But even still, they were raised quite considerably academically as well, with their parents taking them to places like museums, places of historical interest, and even to classical music concerts, I assume in the local Melbourne, which was about 10-15 minute drive away. They also played classical music in the house. Leigh learned to play the piano himself, eventually reaching grade 8, which is the highest grade available, and his favourites were Chopin and Gilbert and Sullivan. This allowed him an emotional escape from the mundane life that existed in Sunshine, which he would go on to describe to friends later in unfavorably dull terms. I think, and this is just me speculating, that this may have contributed to him wanting to be a comedian when he was a kid as well, because Gilbert and Sullivan were known for comedy operas. So when he announced his ambition at either 7 or 8 years old, according to his sister, there may have been a parallel line there drawn. Nevertheless, his favourite thing about his younger years, aside from music, was their country home in Macedon, which I hope I pronounced correctly, is a small nearby village that housed their cousins, where they would play, bike, and swim with each other, or sometimes with friends that they'd made in church, primary, or secondary school if they took them along with them to the two-roomed shack that was updated in 1973 to have a brick veneer to share the summer days. In that sense, literally all the things known that Leigh enjoyed in primary school, he just continued to enjoy into secondary school, Sunshine West High School, which he attended from 1972 to 1975, or when he was 11 to 16 years old, where he was equally as straight-laced here as he'd ever been in primary school. Although a strange tidbit about his life at this time was that he had had to have several surgeries around this time as his testicles hadn't dropped when he was a baby. This would usually be a detail I would tactically evade, but it ended up in a domino effect where, due to these surgeries, his aunt had to babysit him. Because his aunt had to babysit him, she taught him to crochet. Because he learned to crochet, he learned to knit, finding an exceptional talent in it after making a cable knit sweater for his first project, which, if you know anything about knitting, is mind-blowingly incredibly talented for a first project. Really impressive. But because he learned how to make that knit sweater, he would then go on to want to learn how to sew. Effectively, if he had never had this testicular complications as a baby, we may never have had Leigh Bowery as the Leigh Bowery that we know today. Even still, with all of that time off, he still excelled academically, and in 1974, he was advised to apply for a scholarship to the music specialist school, Melbourne High School, where he actually was accepted after being only one of 2 students in his whole school to pass the entrance exam. Unfortunately, however, aside from being significantly further away, requiring him to take the train to school, the school had somewhat of an adverse effect on his education. You see, now he was no longer the brightest star in the room, so he just gave up. If he couldn't be the best, he just wasn't interested. Instead, he found himself very interested in the other boys in the school. Back in 1973, when Leigh was 12, he realized he was a gay homosexual, and to him it had been a non-issue. His parents accepted him, as did his sister. When he eventually came out, we're not sure exactly when that is. But naturally, this was when he was in Sunshine West High School, and only about 250 other students were in his same year in a conservative town, so he was unlikely to find any other boys his own age with whom to find kinship in this. However, now, in 1974, 1975, in this new big city Melbourne High School, he also didn't really find anybody. He had some fumblings with other boys his own age in school, and he swears his mother caught him one time with another boy, but nothing major, nothing notable whatsoever. At least this was until one evening on his way home from school, he discovered the company of much older men whom he found cruising in Melbourne Central Station, the train station that he needed to go to and from school. So, from now on, while his parents thought he was at choir practice, Leigh was exploring his newfound libido with basically anyone that was available. He was so fond of this, in fact, that he spent most days after school cruising much older married men there while he was wearing his school uniform, which he later told his friend Anne Holt was usually his key to easy casual intercourse, notably preferring the ugliest people he could find, who apparently were interested in little boys in school uniform. Naturally, this further derailed his education, and from here on out, he actually only aimed for the 50% minimum that he needed to pass the year. He also grew less evangelical Christian at this time, stopping going to the Salvation Army when he was about 15 or 16, though that's probably for the best given their history with the many LGBTQ scandals. But he did actually pass his high school qualifications nonetheless, known as HSE in Australia, I think, in 1978. From here, he was expected to go to study music some more, given his incredible pianist talents, but instead he enrolled in the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology to study fashion, having been interested in sewing all the way back from when his auntie taught him how to crochet. But he didn't really love it because the school ended up being very commercially minded, not creatively minded, as he was interested in. So instead of learning a lot about how to express his creativity, he would just learn how to sew here, which was kind of great because before this, he really only knew how to crochet and knit still at this time, even though he was very talented at this, making himself a knitted suit that was very shocking to the conservative locals. In that sense, he was kind of lucky to be living in a bedsit in Melbourne for the duration of the course, not back in Sunshine, because he simply could explore his creativity more freely without the more judgmental evangelical crowd breathing down his neck. He grew his hair into a bob, wore colourful clothing, and took to sewing so much that he even began to send back very, very extreme fashions to his parents, like a shockingly extreme raglan sleeve jacket, which must have looked something like this. Don't tell the church elders. Unfortunately for Leigh, he had put himself in the most creative place that he could for the financial background that he had, and it just wasn't enough. They just weren't ready for his shockingly extreme raglan sleeves. Instead, he found solace in 1979 in the punk music scene and dreaming of London's new romantic club scene, which he was reading about in magazines. By 1980, he decided he would move there. Leigh didn't exactly have a plan of action, despite dropping out of college to pursue this dream, but his heterosexual biological father told him that before he could condone it, he'd probably better have a contingency money stash of about $1,000 Australian in case he needed a quick boomerang. Guess what I did there? Back. He scrimped, he saved, he worked to earn the money, and in the October after his 19th birthday, sewing machine in hand, he was off to London. He'd saved the money that he needed. Along with him came a friend named Peter Kutsumbas, pictured here, who equally wanted to experience the London New Romantics, which I probably should tell you in case you don't know, was an underground subculture movement that originated in London, which is probably most famous today for the looks of people like Boy George and Pete Burns. They looked like this, so did all of the New Romantics. Together, they found a bedsit at the top of a house just off of the Fulham Place Road, and initially did all the touristy things, missing out on the newly booming New Romantic underground nightlife. Though Leigh was still enjoying nights nonetheless because his fondness for cottaging had only grown, and basically London in the 1980s was definitely a hotbed of that. Very occasionally, Leigh did go back to these men's homes, but he actually found this was discomforting because they lacked taste in home furnishings. So cottaging was more his scene, and he didn't do the casual hookups that is more commonly known. The setup seemed to be quite amicable and happy, but it didn't really last very long, as shortly after they arrived, Peter decided to visit family in Greece and never returned for Christmas as promised. This actually really affected Leigh because basically they'd only been in England for 2 months, he had no friends aside from Peter, and this was his first Christmas and New Year's abroad ever, and he was forced to spend it completely alone after weeks of begging Peter in unrequited letters to return. Leigh subsequently hated Christmas and spent every subsequent year for the rest of his life ignoring it entirely. Now alone, Leigh found himself in a new routine. Sleep until lunchtime in a ragged t-shirt and tea cozy worn as a hat, get up, either watch daytime TV or maybe chat to some friends on the phone about nothing in particular, and then sew something in the afternoon. It took him a full 20 days in 1981 for him to actually get to one of the nightclubs that he'd been reading about and even came to England for. But because he didn't think he would get in to the more famous club, which was called the Blitz, he acquiesced to another club called the Great Wall instead, which wasn't as good, but he did meet some of the people that he'd read about in magazines, including the stylist Kim Bowen and the designer Stephen Lennard. The night was really rubbish. No one had a particularly good time at the Great Wall, but what I love about it is in Sue Tilley's biography, she comes with a full description of what he wore for his first proper night out in London, which I'm sure she lifted straight from his diary, which gives us an insight into what he thought club kids dressed like at this time. Quote, Leigh wore a stunning outfit of a gold brocade blouse, grey breeches, white stockings, and black slippers. But he was particularly proud of his hair, which at this stage was bleached blonde. He'd rolled up the sides so that they made a curl on either side of his head like 2 sausages and had finished the look off with a black velvet headband. This illustration is done by my friend Perry Picasso of what we think, or what he thinks, this look may have looked like. Do give him a follow on Instagram. I'm really grateful that he was able to help with this project. Thank you very much, Perry. This was the outfit that would start off an incredible legacy. But yet, the money that he had brought with him to sustain his life in London was quickly running low. He had no intention of A, stopping clubbing, or B, returning to Australia, so instead, he signed up for government stipends for the poor, he took to shoplifting, and also found himself a job at Burger King on the Strand in London, where he perfected his new British accent, neglecting to tell people for years after this initially where he was from. This included new friend Peter Miller, who, being an Australian himself, invited Leigh to share his bedsit at 133 Gloucester Terrace. It wasn't his first choice, but as Peter Kutsumbas, the friend that he travelled to London with, was certainly not returning by this point, he just couldn't afford the original apartment and thought this new apartment with Peter Miller was basically his only option. The new home was small, the boys shared 2 single beds in one bedroom, and they only had a small kitchen and bathroom off the main room. It was very far from ideal, but the boys worked opposite shifts, so at least it was manageable and allowed Leigh space to sew while Peter was at work. Quote, "For the first year in London, Leigh only made clothes for himself. He made things in the neo-romantic style to fit in with the scene that he almost just missed. He would sometimes make a shirt for a friend or to send back to Bronwyn in Australia as a present, but all the time he was working at Burger King, he was desperate to become involved somehow in fashion." Honestly, it seems that he was a little unhappy. He didn't love his job, he didn't love his apartment, he wasn't satisfied with his Burger King friends. He found them very plain, very normal, and he'd even begun to hate his roommate Peter for embodying this mundane life that Leigh had not come all this way to experience. They weren't exactly nice to each other. Peter read Leigh's diary, which had scathing reports of his opinions on Peter, while Leigh very surreptitiously rummaged through all his things and even read his mail. This eventually came to a head when they took a trip to Paris that April, and the idea of returning to London just saddened Leigh. So 4 months later, in July 1981, he decided he was going to move out. He found a place on Queensborough Terrace, not too far away, and he kept his job at Burger King, which meant that Peter wasn't exactly out of his life entirely because that's where they had met. And because Peter had actually been promoted to assistant manager, the dynamic probably got a little bit more uncomfortable, strange. Actually, it seems that he probably would have quit if he wasn't making an extra £50 a night stealing from the till. As it was, he worked there most of 1981, and in fact, as we know that he was still working there fiddling tills in October 1981, we know that this was about the time that his luck was about to change. You see, this was the month that he discovered, quite by chance, a flyer for Andrew Logan's alternative Miss World competition. And come hell or high water, Leigh was going, even if he had to do it alone. Largely thanks to David Corio uploading his photos onto Getty, we can actually see exactly what Leigh would have seen at this exact event. Unfortunately, there's no pictures of Leigh, but we know, because of David Corio, that this was a loud, colourful, very, very fun year. Everything that Leigh had been dreaming of since his lonely Australian teen years. Finally, he had found his tribe of people. That evening, while in the bathroom, he met drag artist Yvette the Conqueror, pictured here at the 2025 Leigh Bowery retrospective at the Tate Gallery opening, who took Leigh under her wing, gave him her phone number, and invited him to dinner the following week. If the night at the Grand Wall had been the amuse-bouche to his taste of club kid life, this was his key to the main course. The pair met up several times over the course of the next few weeks. He met Steve Strange thanks to Yvette and was introduced to the iconic London gay bar, Heaven, and more importantly, their alternative night, Cha Cha Cha. She had given him the tools to make London the dreamscape that he had always hoped it would be. From here, every Tuesday he spent at Cha Cha Cha. He started drinking more, started taking recreational supplements. He finally found new friends who were more to his taste, including a then-named Gary Barnes from Croydon, who would later become one of Leigh's lifelong friends, very important to his life, who you may know by his pseudonym, Trojan. However, this does bring me on to probably one of the most unfavorable traits of Leigh Bowery in any media about him, is that he loved to have total control over his friends. He didn't like them intermingling too much. He would tell them what to do. He had them follow him around. This is extensively documented in multiple pieces of media, including Sue Tilley's book. She even goes as far as to call them slaves multiple times. Quote, Leigh loved to have someone at his beck and call at all times. His first slave in this country was a girl called Lorraine. Leigh took pity on her and decided to befriend her, which was very easy as she was desperate to be liked. Leigh made her do everything for him, do his shopping, his cooking, and his cleaning, and if she did something wrong, he would furiously tell her off. Rachel Auburn thought that Lorraine was the most subservient person she had ever met in her life and couldn't believe what Leigh did when they spent a weekend in Amsterdam. He made her sit outside the Rijksmuseum, topless, with a handwritten sign hung around her neck saying, "Give me money." Eventually, Leigh got fed up with Lorraine's total devotion. As he found more fancy, fashionable friends, he dropped her. He would also somewhat compete with his friends as well on top of this. Trojan, for example, slept with a man Leigh considered to be his boyfriend in around 1985, taking great pleasure in his covert affair when Leigh was bragging of their rendezvous. So, in a way, Leigh reaped what he sowed. And for many people, this was a willing environment as they had all met their mischievous matches. Pranking each other with bodily fluids and solids, if you get what I mean, picking on each other and equally making each other laugh. Soon, their friendship group expanded to David Holler, Rachel Auburn, Trojan, Lorraine, and Leigh. And frankly, save for Lorraine, they really did end up all being lifelong friends. So, as rough as some of these things sound in the video, and some of the things in the video later on as well, it's worth remembering that this was just the culture of the lifestyle at the time. In a more mainstream way, you can see it in things like Party Monster, early seasons of RuPaul's Drag Race, or the documentary Paris is Burning. I also know that you guys know that I was a club kid in my youth, so it's hard for me to explain this very well because it is cruel the way that it comes across, but it's a willing cruelness that is meant in fun and always unserious. You would never actually want to hurt anyone's feelings. Although I think Leigh's friend George Gallagher explains this really well in an interview for this video. He said, quote, "It was part of the culture of the time. We were all living in a John Waters Divine movie. Everyone trying to outdo each other. His relationship with women was tricky. However, I believe they were mutually beneficial." Trojan and Leigh soon moved in together at the beginning of 1982, sharing a large bedsit with two sisters named Debbie and Marula, though quickly falling out with the sisters and moving separately outwards. Trojan moved to a flat on Caledonian Road, and Leigh moved to a bedsit in a large house in Ladbroke Grove, where David Walls would soon move as well. Here, David and Leigh bullied their neighbor into moving out so Leigh could have that space as a studio, which I assume they either did covertly for free or paid for with their government stipends, as Leigh had recently been fired from Burger King when they realized that he was stealing. Not that that changed much though, because he still continued to shoplift to acquire the things that he wanted, went out almost every night, and got drunk basically off of whatever was on offer in their local Sainsbury's. The clubs, however, were changing. The new romantic look that Vivienne Westwood debuted with just the previous year had become a bit old hat on the underground scene, and instead the complete exact opposite of the look, called hard times, became the thing, thanks to designers like Sue Klaus and Melissa Kaplan. But 1982 didn't just stop giving there, because it was in this year of 1982 when Leigh would finally meet Sue Tilley, whose book I have referenced several times in this video already. Leigh quickly took a shine to Sue because he saw her making out with her brother on the floor of the club. The man actually was not her brother. She just lied to Leigh that he was his brother, and he thought it was hysterical, which is why they became friends. In this respect, she was more daring than Leigh at this time. As she describes that, quote, "He did not stand out as being particularly outrageous. He was dressed the same as all his friends, and he hadn't covered his cheery, dimpled face with obvious makeup." But they got on nonetheless, and another gem was added to their growing friendship group. In fact, there are so many names circling around this story at the time that I've just decided to cut basically all of them out for brevity. I'm really sorry to many of these people. I know it's a very important moment in everybody's lives. Back to the timeline. In about September 1982, David Walls moved out of the large bedsit on Ladbroke Grove and into Trojan's flat on Caledonian Road, which meant that Leigh was now officially homeless for a spell. He first camped out at Rachel Auburn's house, who, by the way, he'd only just met a few months earlier, until well into 1983, when he found a council flat on Percival Street that was unoccupied and decided to squat there. Quote, "Then, for some strange reason, David and Trojan moved in too. They all lived and slept in the same room. Trojan and Leigh sharing a double bed and David in a single. This was very claustrophobic, especially as none of them were working. Leigh used to spend his days cottaging just to get out the house." During this time, 100% thanks to Rachel Orburn's influence, Leigh began to design and produce his own clothes under his own namesake label, Leigh Bowery, and sell them in a neighbouring store to hers in Kensington Market. The clothes were described almost like Vivienne Westwood's Nostalgia of Mud collection from autumn-winter 1982, so I'll put up pictures of that if I can't find any pictures confirmed of Leigh Bowery's garments, but specifically, they featured a star on the front of the garments embedded into the pattern making, so not appliqued on top, which would actually become a theme of his work soon after he dropped the Vivienne West dupes. Though this more commercial line in particular never became successful as he had wanted, but they do today remain collector's items, including for Kim Jones, whom Sue Tilley gifted several pieces to, a fact that just blows my mind. Because instead of finding success in commerciality, he was on the cusp of a much more interesting style, which he had perfected in concept but had yet to enact. Specifically, I'm talking about his first actually true club kid look, which he forced Trojan to debut instead of doing it himself because he was shy. This very first look is never really documented in pictures, so again I asked my friend Perry Picasso to illustrate it based on this wording from Sue's book. Quote, "Leigh had been too scared to wear the new look out at first and had made Trojan debut it. Leigh dressed and styled him. He wore a long satin robe with a big star on the front, stripy tights, painted platform boots, and a tall hat with a bit of hair from an old wig he'd found stuck on the back to look like he had flowing locks. He covered his whole face in blue, green, or red makeup and stuck sequins on top, or he would sometimes paint extra features on like a Picasso painting. He might paint a profile of a nose in green paint next to his real nose, or extend his mouth about an inch to one side. He would complete the look with various bits of cheap Indian jewelry that they bought down Brick Lane, such as stick-on nose rings with a chain that went to the ear." This look was meant to be shocking. It was meant to be slightly offensive as well, given the name that they dubbed it included a racial slur for Pakistanis, but this was 1983. The concept of being actively offensive was still very much in effect, even popular. Think Vivienne Westwood's late 70s designs that included Sawadi cars, which I hope you know because I very likely can't show you these t-shirts being that we're now on YouTube. Maybe I'll put it in for my Patreon patrons. Actually, there's also a photo of Leigh sewing a whole outfit out of a Sawadi car fabric, and I'll add that in as well. Because truly, this was the era of being really offensive to be noticed. Leigh's swastikas, unlike Vivienne Westwood's, were in the opposite direction, i.e. were from Buddhism and a symbol of peace, but that didn't matter. This was symbolism meant to be taken for humor and for social commentary, but meant to get attention, and it did work. It worked for Westwood, it worked for Leigh, it worked for many, many, many others, as it does now, even if it is removed from those imagery usages. Anyway, this look went on to be really heavily photographed, both of Leigh and of Trojan sporting the look. It was really the first look of Leigh's that involved a full face of makeup, and it's really this that gained them the initial bout of club scene fame. Not major fame, as many people have pointed out, including Boy George in the 2002 documentary that a face full of colourful makeup had been done many a time before, and in Vranou's 2020 paper, From Outer Space, Oriental Postmodernity and Leigh Bowery's Performative Costuming, which analyses the look in detail, she points out how this kind of assimilation of high culture with low aesthetics, by which she is referring to the racial prejudice that South Asian culture is low, was actually rather common in the 1980s as a kind of aesthetic populism to convey a global culture. But alas, it was enough of a departure from the way that it had been done before to gain a slither of notoriety. And obviously, the looks only continued upwards from here. Quote, "The next makeup look was to complement his new frilly designs, which he made stockings with frills at the top, pinnies and very detailed blouses covered in pockets, intricate collars and full sleeves. The cutting was very unusual, and lots of the garments had uneven sleeves and clever capes and flounces. The colours were pink, brown and white. Most of it was made in pink gingham or synthetic lace, which he was able to buy very cheaply on Brick Lane. He He made large, floppy hats to match, and even covered shoes in the frills so they resembled very large slippers. The makeup consisted of wide panels of white, brown, and pink aquacolor painted onto the face, and at first, he still had some blue around the edge and a couple of bindis in the middle of his forehead so that it wasn't such a big step from the look. If Leigh was feeling particularly daring, he would wear this look without the frilly knickers so that his bottom was bare. This look was so popular, in fact, that it led him to being included in a fashion show, I think at the ICA, and then repeated in Manchester at the Hacienda Club. If not, it wasn't just one fashion show, it was 3, where he was asked to show off his latest collection, which supposedly included his frilly era designs in one-off iterations that didn't really resemble the more commercial pieces that he had been selling at Kensington Market. Actually, it's implied that because of the interest he found, it was this that catalyzed the closing of his stall entirely. He just didn't find that he liked the repetition of the store clothing as much as he enjoyed the creativity of the club clothing. It was also the catalyst for nightclub legend Suzanne Barsh to invite Leigh and Rachel Auburn to New York to show again at the Roxy. The domino effect continued here, leading Leigh to denounce his influence from Vivienne Westwood and instead make a greater effort to be truly original in his ideas, which saw the invention of his third era, which doesn't have a specific name as far as I could find, but it's described as so unfashionable and not like anything else by Tilley, which I just love. Quote, "It was 70s glitter, satin, stretchy fabrics, and fake fur." But it worked. He saw a notable increase in press coverage and led to 2 major events in Leigh's life. Number 1, he got on TV, firstly in a show called North of Watford, which I have to limit the footage just to Leigh, and secondly, he also got in another unnamed show which I couldn't find, but was supposedly a children's show about pop and fashion, focusing on Leigh, a fashion brand called Body Map, and Jay Aston from Bucks Fizz, who was the interviewer. And 2, this aforementioned press coverage led him to meet a man called Michael Clark in a club called The Circus, which was featured on North of Watford. This was colossally important to Leigh's life because Michael Clark was a rising star in dance, having been classically trained, and then he infused that with queer dance that he'd learned in nightclubs, think voguing. Michael and Leigh got on like Karens drinking a cup of tea over passive-aggressive comments, and it wasn't long before Michael hired Leigh to design costumes for his dance group's performances, beginning with a show called Flippin' Eck O Thweet Mythery of Life that same year, debuting the show the following year as per the Michael Clark Dance Company's website. But interestingly, it was in these designs that the star motif would return along with other classics like hot pants, striped tights, and wedged platform shoes. These men ended up being very, very close. They found a kinship in each other that was also professionally rewarding for both. But their relationship was not romantic. Instead, Leigh, I think in 1983, began to develop a crush on his flatmate Trojan. Quote, "Trojan was the true love of Leigh's life. Leigh adored him and thought he was the most gorgeous man he'd ever met. He was thin and about 6 feet tall with thick brown hair that he changed the style of on a weekly basis. He was named the Face of 84 by the Observer magazine. Trojan loved Leigh too, but in a different way. He didn't fancy him, but he admired his quick wit, his intelligence, his ideas, and the way that he could make things happen. So it was a strange relationship in which, to all intents and purposes, Leigh was in charge. He bossed Trojan around and designed his clothes, but Trojan held the trump card. Leigh fancied him, and he couldn't have him." On multiple occasions, Leigh then tried to get Trojan into bed, but not to any avail. Very late that year, the 4 flatmates, Trojan, Leigh, David Walls, and Rachel Auburn, decided that they were tired of squashing into Rachel's tiny room, so Trojan staged a homophobic arson attack by pouring gasoline through the letterbox and setting it alight, which led the council to find them more sizable lodgings on Ronald Street in a building called Farrell House, 3/4 of a mile from Brick Lane. The home was on the 11th floor of a 1960s brown brick block estate and actually seemed quite sizable. Quote, "There was a biggish hall inside the front door with all the other rooms leading off of it. 3 bedrooms, a large lounge with fantastic views over the city and the Thames, a small balcony, and a kitchen, bathroom, and toilet." David Walls left after about 6 weeks, but the rest of them were very, very happy here. Leigh turned David's room into a workroom and decorated the lounge famously in his Star Trek wallpaper, which is very, very often repeated in Leigh Bowery retrospectives in museums to this day. Though you should know that this is much, much cleaner than it sounds when it's described, because Sue, in her book, she says about wallpaper and flooring peeling, the bathroom being covered in removed makeup. They also had cats by this point. No, I'm not sure when that began. They had 2 cats before this, neither dated. And they didn't really clean up well after these cats. So there was cat hair, cat smell in the air in the room, which probably included cat pee as a smell, because Leigh was fond of wrapping a pee-drenched towel over the cat's nose if the cat peed on his fabric, which, I'll be honest, is a little concerning considering this cat, whose name is Angus, was supposedly treated better than the 2 preceding cats, one of which Trojan abandoned in a box on the tube and the other which Trojan dumped off the balcony, which is horrifying. Another horrifying kind of thing, but at least this one's not really their fault, story from 1984 is when Leigh, artist Sereth Wynne Evans, and his boyfriend Angus, who the cat was actually named after, hired a, quote, 6-foot-tall, masculine, muscular, and preferably a skinhead exotic dancer, but instead was sent a 12-year-old boy from the agency. Luckily, none of the boys are Prince Andrew, so they felt awful when the boy tried to do his job. They put money in his hand and just let him get dressed and sleep on the sofa to avoid the very expensive taxi fare. Apparently, Sereth felt even worse when the boy asked him to buy some sweets for him when he was walking the child to the bus stop. So, at least they were also horrified by this. This time in their life also was marked with an uptick of their drug consumption, most notably acid, because Leigh realized that if he could get Trojan to take it, then he would reciprocate his sexual attraction to him, leading them to actually, but briefly, have a sexual relationship, which naturally thrilled Leigh, who'd had a crush for months on Trojan. His professional life was also taking off at this point. Here's a list of the many successes that he had in 1984 alone. Ready? After the success of Flippin' Eck O Thweet Mythery of Life, he designed again for Michael Clarke in his show Hail the New Puritan, which was a smash success. Leigh was featured on a TV show called The Tube, being interviewed by Paula Yates. He was invited yet again to New York by Suzanne Barsh to do a show at the legendary club, The Limelight. He became somewhat of a local celebrity in New York as well, even meeting the now disgraced Gary Glitter, which was a big deal at the time. He met Rifat Uzbek in London at the Pyramid Club, which soon turned into a professional relationship, but I'll come back to that one. Leigh appeared for the first time in ID magazine, not on the cover as many sources, including books, not Sue Tilley's book luckily, seemed to think, but actually it was in the pages of the issue from September 1984. He and Trojan produced their first advertised performance together at the Hail Mary Club, which for monetization reasons I cannot describe to you. I'm sorry, it's too grotesque for the overlords at Google. He made clothes for Blancmange, Lana Pilet, though that came later, and Boy George. Leigh and Trojan also separately appeared in unnamed movies made by Sereth Wynne Evans and John Mabry, which I think is actually called Psychic TV Unclean, but I'm not 100% sure. Suzanne Barsh, later in 1984, took Leigh to Japan to show off his work, and he shocked the Japanese, obviously. The Face dedicated a double-page spread to Trojan and Leigh called The New Glitterati later that year. And finally, this is when he started to incorporate swastikas into his own fashions, which didn't seem to last too long, as it's really only a couple of his looks that even the people who adored him told was just too far. It does continue later, but I'll get to that. I mean, you can very clearly see this was an exceptional year for Leigh, save for that last one. And to think that he did all of this on top of hosting his mother in his flat earlier in the year and his sister Bronwyn for the summer, taking her all around the country. And it was really only up from here. In early January 1985, Leigh was approached by a man named Tony Gordon to open their own club night, along with a lady called Angela Farley, who similarly had some fame, having featured in the Relax, Get To It music video for Frankie Goes to Hollywood, which they would host in a small nightclub in Leicester Square called Maximus. Leigh would be the face of the night and would be the draw to make it the place to be seen in London. Quickly on this, and the club was already open by the 31st of January 1985, just later that same month. It was a hit from day one, but in no way did its initial success compare to the success it was about to see. To quote Leigh's friend and drag artist Leigh Child, quote, "It was all right, but I didn't like the space and there certainly wasn't the buzz that came about 2 months later." By this point, Angela had been kicked out of the Taboo deal for not really any other reason other than they just didn't need her, and still the queue for the club was down the street. It had been heavily featured in Blitz magazine as well as in ID magazine, where he was shot for the first time by legendary photographer Nick Knight, which I'm just going to pause on for a second because I reached out to Show Studio, which was founded by Nick Knight many years later, just about when they met for some further information, and he did say this was the photo shoot that they met on, but they also gave me an entire timeline of each time Leigh was shot by Nick Knight during his life. Not every individual picture, because Nick Knight shot him and his friends regularly at different club nights, and according to the email they sent me, they had a very long-standing personal friendship as well. A friendship which had an immense impact on Leigh's lasting memory, as despite the fact that Nick Knight is not really commonly mentioned in biographies of Leigh Bowery, his photography work of Leigh from this moment on had an immense impact on Leigh's lasting memory after he passed away a few years into the future, as some of his most reposted images are actually Nick Knight's work. A great thanks from the Show Studio team, because this was far, far more than I expected to hear back from you for. I'm just really grateful for it. But to continue on with the promotion of Taboo, there was also a whole episode of South of Watford dedicated to the Taboo nightclub. It's on YouTube. Brilliant. Hugh Laurie's in it. I'll put the name of the video in the top right because it does well encapsulate both Leigh's progression and the club as well, which at the time was touted as the antidote to Margaret Thatcher's vision of a harsh Britain, as well as a distraction from the incoming fear of AIDS, which still nobody really knew anything about other than the fact that it was killing queer people, the majority of whom gay men. In turn, this meant that now Bowery was the face of this new, very buzzworthy club. There was increased pressure for him to turn a new look every Thursday, pushing his creations to become increasingly more extreme from week to week, and pushing him to shave his hair because it grew too slowly to keep up with how quickly he needed new hairstyles. Though it is well pointed out that they were still doing clothing-like looks. Here's another illustration from Perry of how his clothes were described in Sue Tilley's book. So we know that it's not quite yet what he would become. This also meant that Leigh needed a replacement for his previous slave, i.e. what he called his assistant or unofficial assistant, and found a lady called Fat Jill who was equally as willing as Lorraine to be subservient. Quote, "She took to slavery like a duck to water and was soon turning up at Leigh's to do his cleaning. But he was so bossy that if she turned up 10 minutes early, he would make her wait on the doorstep until the appointed hour. He also persuaded her to shave her head so that she would look much prettier. To cheer her up after he'd done it, he painted her a lovely new hairstyle with black aqua colour. He once took Fat Jill to dinner at Michael and Galen Costiff's, but said she wasn't allowed to sit at the table. He opened up all the cupboards until he found the oven cleaner and told her that this was her job for the evening. Galinda, being a kind-hearted soul, was horrified and to Leigh's apparent disgust put her at the head of the table." It's kind of hard to place how long Fat Jill was with Leigh. Many people that I was interviewing or questioning for this video didn't really seem to know her, but she was undoubtedly an important part of his growth at this early point, helping him come up with so many of his iconic looks, including his first entry into alternative Miss World, which was in 1985, which you can see here along with this look that Fat Jill usually wore, which I probably have to blur for YouTube, sorry about that. He lost this year regardless to a robot named Miss Rosa Bosom, made by Bruce Lacey, and then he lost again the following year. The winner that year was Jenny Runacre. Fat Jill also likely helped create costumes for Leigh and Michael's dance performances, though she's never really credited, which is a shame because they had their biggest breakout in 1985 when they were commissioned to choreograph and costume No Fire Escape in Hell for the Paris Opera. Actually, This was such a big deal that their friend Charles Atlas made a documentary of the work that went into it starting in spring 1985 and running up all until early 1986 when the ballet debuted in Le Centre Pompidou, so really a big deal. From this point on, Leigh had some semblance of money. Taboo made him a couple of £100 a week. His work with Michael was also fruitful, and he was fairly regularly appearing on various TV shows as well. Too many to name them all. They still couldn't really afford their own home though, and in mid-1985, Trojan once again committed arson to fake a queer-bashing attempt in order for him to get himself a new home, and that, in combination with visiting the doctor to fake depression, got him a new, separate council flat in Notting Hill Gate, which was still at the time quite a rough area. But he moved here with his new boyfriend, John Maybury. Trojan himself had been rebounding from his ex, David Holler, who I mentioned earlier, with John, and John was rebounding from his own ex with Trojan too. But unfortunately, having them move in together meant that they both kind of encouraged each other in their assumed sadness into taking hard drugs throughout the daytime, not just at night when they were going clubbing. And not just with clubbing materials like acid or speed either, but things that involved small packages, silver foils, wraps, syringes, if you catch my drift. Naturally, Leigh was increasingly concerned about this. He didn't particularly like drugs whatsoever, and soon he realized that if he could keep them in his house, or if he played the piano for them at their house, that he could stop them taking more. But it just didn't really help. As Trojan's life was taking a downward trajectory, Leigh's was further soaring. He was on the cover of Lamb magazine in September. Taboo had become a major celebrity hotspot. John Galliano started using it to promote his latest fashion shows. Drugs became even more rampant in the scene at nighttime as well. And Leigh personally refocused his sexual attractions onto a boy called Malcolm Duffy, who, despite expressing that he was not interested in Leigh, would repeatedly find himself waking up to being sexually molested. Quote, "Sometimes I would wake up and he would be sucking my aubergine. I used to lie on my stomach wrapped in a sheet because I didn't want him to do it." Naturally, they didn't remain friends for long, but Malcolm would eventually help out with Leigh's musical career a bit later on in the story. At the same time as that, Leigh would also meet a woman named Nicola Bateman, who took to him as he had taken to Malcolm, just without the sexual assault. Nicola was just another guest at Taboo when she met Leigh, but she was besotted immediately. By the end of the evening of them chatting, he gave her his phone number, but when she phoned the next day, he didn't remember her. At least not at first, before being reminded. He offered for her and her friend to come to stay at his apartment the following week, and very shortly after Leigh realized the impact of them as a duo after they went out, she became his next willing slave. Quote, "A lot of the time, Leigh was really horrible to Nicola. Usually she would put up with it, but sometimes she just snapped and started shouting at him. He would pick her up and lock her on the balcony of his flat. She would shout for a couple of hours, but then she would start laughing at the absurdity of the situation. Once he heard her laugh, he would let her back in. Or he would lock her in the bathroom or toilet, and to get her own back, she would screech out Whitney Houston songs, which I'm sure was a great kindness because really it could have been Katy Perry. Once Nicola started sequencing for Leigh, she spent most of her time at his flat. She was a very diligent worker and would individually sew sequins on for hours at a time. So at first it was a very one-sided relationship in this manner. I'm no psychologist, but to me it sounds like entrapment abuse or coercive control because he was awful to Nicola, as he had been to most of his friends, because he knew that they wouldn't leave. And yet, much like most who do this, he really did need her. He really never had somebody that loved him romantically. The men he met cottaging certainly couldn't. Trojan certainly didn't. Malcolm definitely didn't. He just didn't have someone that loved him until Nicola. And he really needed that. He just didn't know how to express that in a healthy way. In my opinion, I think it mirrors very well the relationship that he had with Trojan. Leigh held all the cards by anyone's assumption, but Nicola and Trojan were in this willingly as they held the ace. He was just as desperate for them as they were for him. It's just he wouldn't let anybody know. Similarly, he knew that Taboo had run its course. Despite its obvious fame, which had now reached Japan, the US, even back to Australia, and how famous it had made Leigh, the problem with injectable drugs had got to an unignorable level, and the club just wasn't as exclusive as it once had been. Don't get me wrong, lasting well for over a year as a club night in London's 1980s was an incredible feat. It's just nothing good can really last. So when a man named Peter Paul Hartnett told Leigh that he can just get the club closed for how grimy it had become, they decided to leak to the press, You magazine, a very, very scathing review of how debaucherous it had become. It was closed the next day. Quote, "This early closure led to part of the legend of Taboo. It stopped when people still wanted more." Instead, Leigh went in further with his live performances, even doing a disastrous performance in his hometown of Melbourne, which nobody ever seems to have forgotten. He went further with his fashion, being featured on the Clothes Show on the BBC, and even showed a menswear collection in a fashion show in Vienna in 1986 that included each model adorned with his famous drippy head look. And he also went further with the Michael Clark Dance Company, finally joining the group as a dancer starting 1987 in a show I believe is called Because We Must, for which the promotional images were shot by Nick Knight, the photographer that I told you about earlier, while Leigh Bowery obviously still designed the costumes, as well as being a dancer in this performance, going on to even tour with this performance later on in the year. So really, even though Taboo had closed, everything in Leigh's life was still on the up. Trojan, however, was not quite as lucky. In August 1986, Trojan overdosed at home. Trojan died while cooking dinner. His boyfriend, John Maybury, overdosed the following week. Fortunately, he did survive in intensive care, and Leigh basically dropped everything to be there for John, despite how incredibly hard he was mourning himself, visiting every day while he was in hospital just to make him laugh. This seems actually typical of Leigh, as almost everyone that I spoke to, as well as in Sue Tilley's book, they could give an example of where Leigh was generous, from paying for drinks and food to including them on his performances abroad so that they got a free holiday. Even the people who worked at Taboo got paid a minimum of £50 a night for their effort, which was generous for the time. Quote, "For my 1981 onwards, he would always make me an item of clothing for my birthday. If I went round his flat, he would often give me a t-shirt or a shirt for free. He was also a great listener and had that rare skill of making you feel really important when you were talking to him. In fact, it was charisma, total charisma. He just had a way with him. I think he enjoyed people and being around them." But still, even though he could put aside his pain to use his incredible charisma to console John, Leigh never really recovered from this loss. Even as his career continued to soar, he just never could forget his closest friend and confidant. There's a story in Sue Tilley's book that's a bit haunting, that many years later he said that he could still remember the exact weight of Trojan's hand in his, if he was given weights to check it. Just really stuck with me. The rest of 1987 is a bit of a blur, except for the aforementioned tour with the Michael Clark Dance Company. Nothing really much seems to happen, except, unfortunately, on the 30th of November 1988, it was about to get worse. It was on this day that he was diagnosed with HIV. Obviously, this was because he was cottaging throughout the day to make up for the lack of action that he could get at night because of the way he was dressed, but this was 1988. People didn't really know how it was being passed on. I mean, scientifically we knew, but colloquially, the people understanding this, the understanding was very weak. And of the many people I asked about this, they were very clear that even as queer people, it just wasn't 100% clear on how and why it was passed on. Much later on in his life, Leigh did say that his greatest regret was having so much unprotected intercourse. So we knew on some level, he knew where it came from. It's not like it was a mystery to him, but the understanding of it and the acceptance of that understanding was clearly two different things. But they did know that it would kill him. Leigh changed basically overnight. He stopped having intercourse with Nicola and instead used other plastic aubergines. He also tried to stop cottaging, though instead he just continued, but while using condoms. And lastly, he became even more guarded about his private life, telling absolutely no one that he'd contracted the disease for fear that they would treat him differently. But what made all of this worse was the timing. 1988 was the year Leigh's career would explode in success. He got his dream job as the assistant on Take the Blame on MTV. His fashions became much more expensive now, including heavily sequined fabrics, velvets, satins, and exotic fabrics, which now shrouded his face as he started to wear face bikinis. And it also evolved into much better corsetry after he met the nightclub legend Mr. Pearl, which itself evolved into his nude female illusion, complete with merkin, and also his neck corsets, one of which appeared in George Michael's music video for Fast Love. His daytime attire also became a famous drag in itself after he gave up on trying to look normal and instead wore very obviously fake wigs, costume-like menswear, and his famous trainers, which concealed a pair of heels inside to make himself even taller. He had his own performance art living installation at the Tate Gallery, which really legitimized his club looks as true artwork in the fine art scene. He even got to promote the show on the Jonathan Ross Show, which was a huge deal at the time. And most importantly, in all of this, in 1988, he started working with Lucian Freud, whom he had met the year prior. His diagnosis, in this sense, had come at the end of his most successful year ever. And it just crushed him. He felt it had destroyed his promised incoming world fame. From here, much of Leigh's life remained on the same upwards trajectory. We'll literally be here for hours if I was to list everything that he did in the next 5 years. So instead, I'm just going to focus on the personal development in this time, because now that he was established in the art scene, thanks to his stint at the Tate Gallery and thanks to starting to work with Lucian Freud, Leigh had newly become kind of snobby. This was a real departure from the Leigh that we knew before, who was much more interested in the grottier side of life. Now, he was rubbing shoulders with Freud's friends, and he started to behave as he thought that he should around these people. Quote, all his friends noticed the change in his voice. He started to speak in a very proper manner and became very authoritative, looking down on people he felt weren't intellectual enough. Of course, that didn't really mean that Leigh's covert behaviors changed very much. He stole money and paintings from Lucian, boasted to his friends, and still continued to try to shock in his nightclub performances, including bringing back a Yahtzee-themed performance which went down like a lead balloon. He'd also later turned Lucian Freud's oil rags from his paintings into a mural of Hitler as well, though that one seems to be preserved by the fine art community. But it wasn't just through Lucian that Leigh had found success. He was still a rising star in his own right, appearing on countless TV shows, traveling the world to do his performances, which I can't really show you on YouTube. And he was even the face of not one, but two major campaigns. The first was for Kodak, and the second was for Pepe Jeans, which this one I can show you. He was so successful by this point that he was able to hire an actual assistant, not just a slave, finally, in August 1990. Who was a talented dressmaker called Leigh Benjamin that he'd met around 1988, whose job it was to materialize the many ideas of Leigh while he was out working. Leigh, being Leigh, also fell into a crush for Leigh, but Leigh wasn't interested because Leigh had a boyfriend called John and was considerably more prudish than Leigh. Obviously, Leigh tried to break up Leigh and John, but to no avail. And Leigh ended up seeming to become a little bit sad that he'd never had a genuinely reciprocal loving relationship, which, make no mistake, he did blame on the way that he looked. Not that he ever let that change him, as Nicola Bateman's boyfriend Alex Binney even pierced his cheeks in 1990, and he started to wear his silhouette modification looks in his club outfits, so there was never remotely a concession made for this. Actually, it's alluded that because he now had HIV and knew that his time was limited, he just used that to propel himself further, faster. Music videos, TV shows, live performances, making clothes, including more commercial clothes for his friends, they all followed. An endless stream of success after success after success. Not even his own arrest for cottaging, which Lucian Freud paid the £400 fine for, could bring him down. This brings me on to 1992, in which the first notable thing that happened was that he stopped working with the Michael Clark Dance Company after Leigh designed a costume with Emily Blunt emblazoned on the front in capital letters, and Michael drew the line in the sand. And the second notable thing was the foundation of his band Quality Street Rappers, shown here in this music video after they changed their name to Raw Sewage only a couple of months later, with Stella Stein, Sheila Tequila, and obviously Leigh Bowery, who performed semi-naked in blackface and genitalless to covers of Run DMC and Aerosmith. This was notable because Leigh also kind of knew this was too far. Quote, "He knew he was ill and was determined to make his mark before he died, and still thought that Raw Sewage would be his passport to international success." Unfortunately, his bandmates didn't really take the project seriously as Leigh was, so by 1993's Love Ball in Amsterdam, they were already at a breaking point, only lasting a few more months, despite them actually performing on Italian TV shortly before their breakup. This led Leigh on two paths. Firstly, he started joining Rifat Uzbek as a consultant for Spring-Summer 94 and Autumn-Winter 94. These dates are assumed given what Rifat said in this book. And secondly, in making a new band with Richard Torrey called Minty, which genuinely did see some success. The YouTube is even updated still fairly recently until a couple of years ago with remixes of their old music. And honestly, some of it's pretty good. There was also the great October 1993 triumph of Lucian Freud's paintings of Leigh, including my personal favorite painting ever, which was famously very, very successful and turned Leigh into an inarguable fine art star. It legitimized in a high art form context all of the work that he'd put into himself thus far. Leigh was riding high. Lucian's paintings were a hit, his own performances were becoming recognized as a true art form in themselves, and his new band Minty was seeing success as well. So, when he proposed to Nicola Bateman randomly in a cab on the way back from a particularly successful Minty performance, it was the perfect way to celebrate the success that he had found. Nicola and Leigh married on Friday the 13th, February 1994, and Nicola planned absolutely every single second of it. She describes in the documentary that it was almost like a performance art piece in itself. They didn't massively take it seriously, but really, it was serious because this was Leigh's way of protecting her right to stay in their house after he died, which seemingly he just instinctively knew would be soon. But little did he know he would not be the first death in his immediate family. Though it's not dated anywhere, in an interview for this project, Sue Tilley assumes that it was around June 1994 that Leigh's beloved mother passed away. Quote, "She had a brain tumor and quickly passed away. Leigh told me that he was dreadfully sad that she had died, but was relieved that he wouldn't have to tell her he was ill and for her to go through his death. He wanted to go to her funeral and was a bit upset that the family organized it before he could get there." Perhaps this is why her death is rarely mentioned in the history of Leigh Bowery. He was dying, yes, but also because he was cut out from her funeral because of the then horrendously long journey to Australia, which would have involved many layovers to stop to refuel. But in reality, Leigh was a mummy's boy growing up. She had come to visit him in London more than once. He went to visit her in Melbourne for that disastrous show in 1988. And so it's just really a shame that this is never ruminated on. And honestly, many of his friends just didn't know when she had passed. Most of the people I interviewed just said that he didn't like to talk about the past. Even Sue Tilley didn't know that he was Australian for years after they met. But one friend, George Gallagher, who was a friend and even model for Leigh in in all of his London shows, was able to tell me, quote, "He was deeply affected by her death. Leigh didn't like to show weakness of any kind, but underneath everything he was very sensitive. In the day he was actually charming and at times slightly nervous, but at the same time confident. He loved his mother deeply and was very affected by her death. I remember him showing me the tattoo inside his lip which said Mum. He was a deeply sensitive soul and didn't like to show weakness, so put on a brave face. But I knew he was deeply affected. I think he got through this through his alter ego, dressing up and going out, as we all did." Really, it's a shame we don't know more about this. I'm sure it was a massive hit at the absolute apex of his career, and unfortunately it was also only months before he also passed away. In September 1994, he took his last holiday ever with Richard Torres to Greece. Towards the end of the holiday, Leigh had disappeared for no particular reason, and when he was found, he'd been pacing in their hotel room. Quote, he found Leigh marching around in a mad panic. He thought that £100 and his Walkman had been stolen from his rucksack. He was convinced that it was the lovely couple who owned the inn. He went and accused them and told them that he was going to report them to the police. This was completely out of character for him, and Richard tried to dissuade him. Then Leigh looked in another pocket of his rucksack and found the stolen property. He felt utterly embarrassed and couldn't face the couple, so he made Richard do a flit with him, leaving the money they owed on the bed. When he got home, this was the first thing that Leigh told me about. I'm really worried, Sue. I think this illness is sending me mad. How could I do such a thing? Normally I just wouldn't care. I'd have never considered going to the police, but the fact that I couldn't find my own things, it's a sign. Leigh, at last, really began to think about the HIV virus. 2 months later, in November, he started to have a headache that wouldn't go away. He had meningitis, a disease which is rough at the best of times, but with someone with an immune-compromised disease was much, much worse. He was quickly admitted to Middlesex Hospital, and as far as his friends or his wife knew, it was only for meningitis. Only Sue Tilley knew the truth. At first, he was told he needed to be there a week, but he didn't improve. Each day, as Sue and Nicola visited, Leigh just got worse and worse, affected by the drugs, affected by the meningitis, and lacking a sturdy immune system to fight the disease off. It wasn't long before people became skeptical about where Leigh was, but he wouldn't tell his secret. 1 week turned into another week, turned into another, and slowly the life drained out of the 33-year-old. He even began wishing for self-unaliving. He was allowed out once for an overnight trip in between treatments, but when he didn't show up the next day and caused an unaliving scare, he was seldom permitted another. Quote, we both sat in his room sobbing for about 5 hours. He said that he knew that he was dying, but I tried to convince him that he would get better. It was the first time that he had seemed to give up hope. He was allowed to see Lucian's show at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in mid-December, but this only awkwardly led to Lucian, who did not know about Leigh's diagnosis, to offer to pay for the best meningitis treatment in the country, but obviously Leigh had to decline. His family too were planning to visit him in London, at this time set to arrive on the 22nd of December. They were let in on the secret, and his dad, Sister Bronwyn, and her boyfriend met Leigh in the airport because he'd made all the effort with his lack of energy to meet them there, having already been told the information. In a sense, the timing for this was awful. Leigh had always hated Christmas after he was abandoned by Peter Kutsumbas in 1980, and now he found himself on his deathbed in a terminal ward at the hospital surrounded by equally upsettingly cheerful Christmas decor. On the 27th, they started giving him morphine to help with the pain. On the 28th, he'd taken a turn for the worse. Leigh's father rushed to the hospital. Bronwyn was on a tour of Britain and couldn't. Lucian was also informed. He came down. Leigh was moved to intensive care. And slowly and covertly, Nicola and Sue began to tell Leigh's other friends that he was on his deathbed. Eventually, Leigh was told he would not survive, and he was given the option of either being kept artificially alive as long as possible, or of them lulling him into sleep. A few more days, he whispered. Friends from all over called in to tell him they loved him. Rifat Uzbek, Rachel Auburn, Michael Clark, Angus Hook all called in and or visited Leigh to let him know that they loved him, all before he passed away soundlessly at 3:10 a.m. New Year's Eve 1994. Quote, he really didn't want to die, but in the end he just stopped breathing. The following day, a glass was raised to Leigh at Angus and Jonathan's flat in Long Acre, where they were celebrating the new year, and plans were made to ship his body back to Australia to be buried with his mother. Lucian paid for the flight. In Australia, there was a very small funeral, only around 8 people. Bronwyn read some Oscar Wilde poetry, and they had a big feast. But the hole that they cut for Leigh just wasn't big enough for the coffin, so they had to wait while they dug the hole larger in somewhat of a metaphor for his life. Too big to fit the mold. That day, it hailed stones the size of golf balls. It just couldn't have been more weird or more perfect. There was a memorial held in London and a posthumous exhibition held in the Tate Gallery in New York in 1995. Lucian debuted his final painting of Leigh that year as well, giving maybe the only picture of Leigh that we can see that he's totally at ease, unguarded and peaceful, just as he is today in death. Leigh's legacy survived then as it does today. Controversial, evocative, brave. He was a man who changed club life in London and pushed the creative soul of the capital further than it had ever been pushed before. And strangely, his life ended up reflecting that of Taboo night that made him a household name. Taboo only lasted a year, and Leigh's career only lasted about 10, both cut in their prime. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe. For videos like this about beauty brands, please check out my beauty channel here, and a special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon for their ongoing support. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.